I spent years building my farm the way I'd always dreamed of, a piece of land inherited from my family, where every fence, every plantation, and every shed had a piece of my sweat. But while I was away sorting out personal issues, the HOA decided that my property was not up to community standards. And their solution? Burn it down. Yes, they set fire to my barn, destroyed everything I had built. What they forgot is that I'm not just any farmer. I'm a veteran. And now this war is personal. Do they think they'll get away with it? Just wait until I start my revenge. When I returned home, the smell of smoke still permeated the air, mixed with the smell of burnt wood and overturned earth. My heart started pounding, even before I saw the scene in its entirety. It was one of those moments when you feel that something has gone very wrong before you even have proof. But when I turned down the dirt road that led to my farm, I didn't need any more proof. The barn? It was a pile of ashes and smoking rubble. The wire fence I'd installed myself, twisted as if it had been through a war. And the main house, although still standing, had dark soot marks running up the walls, like scars left by an unjust battle. And it was at that moment that the realization hit. Someone had set fire to my farm. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a storm. The fire was deliberate. My lungs filled with rage, and my mind, still trained after years in the army, began to process the situation with frightening clarity. I looked around and noticed that some plaques had been driven into the ground. New, shiny plaques, practically screaming arrogance. I walked over to one of them, my boots sinking into the still warm earth, and read the words that made me want to punch something. Repossessed property. Fairview Homeowners Association. The HOA. The fucking HOA. The same entity that had been sending me letters every week about ridiculous infractions, high grass, misaligned fence, worn out shed, as if the farm was a suburban backyard and not a rural property that was here before this damn association even existed. I closed my eyes for a second, taking a deep breath. My grandfather always said that when something went wrong, counting to 10 would help. But I was already on 37 and my anger was only growing. That's when I heard the sound of an approaching engine, a gleaming white pickup truck, the kind that only someone who had never got their hands dirty would drive. It stopped abruptly, and the door opened with that sound of cheap authority. And who got out? The woman, the president of the HOA. With her sunglasses that cost more than a week's hard work and a smug smile, she got out of the car as if she were arriving at a business meeting rather than a crime scene. "I see you've arrived," she said, straightening her jacket. I looked around, then at her. My hands itched to do something far less civilized than reply, but I stopped myself. "Tell me you didn't do it." She made a noise with her mouth, an irritatingly rehearsed, not really sound, before crossing her arms. Her property was in serious violation of HOA regulations. The barn was a fire hazard. Your fence wasn't up to community standard. And that old structure, well, frankly, it didn't fit with the aesthetic we're trying to maintain around here. The aesthetic. The fucking aesthetic. I felt my blood boil. Years of military service had taught me to maintain control. But this? That was an insult. She continued talking as if she were explaining to a child why they can't have sweets before dinner. So, we took action. For the sake of the community's safety, the HOA took legal possession of the land, and we scheduled the demolition. The fire was a small unforeseen. She said it as if I should say, "Thank you," as if they were doing me a favor by destroying everything I had. I laughed. Not a happy laugh, not a nervous laugh, a dry, incredulous laugh, because this woman had no idea who she was dealing with. If she thought she could set fire to my farm, put up a pretty sign and carry on with her life as if nothing had happened, then she was about to learn a very expensive lesson. Because if there's one thing the Army has taught me, it's that when someone touches what's yours, you take it back. And I wasn't just going to get my farm back. I was going to take the soul of this HOA and reduce it to ashes. When I said I was going to reduce this HOA to ashes, I wasn't speaking figuratively. As the woman continued talking as if she were lecturing me on the rules of coexistence, my mind was already working. Tactics, planning, execution. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice. I wasn't just going to accept what they had done to my property. I was going to make sure that the HOA never had the power to do that to anyone again. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. The woman was still standing there, waiting for me to explode or beg for something. But I just shook my head and, without saying a word, walked straight to what was left of my house. She stood still for a second, not knowing if she had won or if something much worse was about to happen. Guess what? It was the second option. The first thing I did when I entered the house was to get my emergency safe. Nothing much, just a small steel safe that held important documents, a little money, and something even more valuable: evidence. Every piece of correspondence that the HOA had ever sent me, from the first warning about the unkempt appearance of my property to the final letter saying that my land had been legally acquired by them. Each of these letters was signed by the same person, that arrogant woman who had just burned down my farm. I opened a thicker envelope that came months ago. I read again the ridiculous clause that said that any property in the HOA area could be acquired if it was considered a security risk. And guess what? Who decided what was a security risk? The HOA itself. It's the equivalent of a fox writing the rules to protect the henhouse. I closed the safe and left. I already knew enough. Now I needed to understand how legally they thought they could get away with it. My first stop was the town hall. If there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that bureaucracy can be both your greatest enemy and your best weapon. I entered the building with my HOA cards in hand and went straight to the property records section. The clerk looked at me like I was just another dumb farmer who couldn't read a contract, but then I threw a pile of papers on his desk and asked, "I want to see the document that proves that this property was legally sold to the HOA." The guy blinked a few times, then picked up the papers and started searching the system. 5 minutes later, he looked up and said, "There's no record of the sale here." I smiled. "Then tell me how the hell they claim ownership over my farm." The guy kept typing, scratched his head, then finally found something. "It looks like it was done through an eminent domain request within HOA guidelines." Ah, now it made sense. They basically made up an excuse, called my farm a danger to the community, and claimed the land for themselves. But there's an important detail about eminent domain. It needs to be approved by the local government. And the only signature on that document? It was from the HOA itself. No judge, no city commission, no public hearing, just them deciding among themselves that they could steal my land. I thanked the city clerk and left. Now I knew how to bring them down. I went back to the farm and started organizing the evidence. I threw everything on the table, sat down, and started planning. I needed to expose this HOA for what it really was: a bunch of suburban tyrants who think they can do whatever they want without consequences. So I did 3 things. I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one who specialized in property fraud and abuse of HOAs. A guy who was always trashing these associations in court. I talked to the neighbors. Not everyone in the HOA liked her. A lot of people had been hurt before, but no one had the guts to stand up to her. Now they had a leader. I called the press. Yes, I wanted the whole world to know. And not just any press. I went straight to a local TV station that loved a scandal. The next day, while I waited for the TV crew to arrive, I sat on the balcony and stared at what was left of my property. The land was still mine. The fire had destroyed a lot, but the essence of the place was still there, and I was going to make sure it stayed that way. Then I heard the roar of an engine. I looked down the road and saw a black car approaching. This time, it wasn't the HOA. It was someone they had sent. And now, things were going to get really interesting. The black car stopped slowly on the dirt road, kicking up dust all around. It wasn't a car. It wasn't anyone from the press. It was one of those pretentious, shiny sedans with dark windows and a driver who probably wore more perfume than sense. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a suit, because, of course, there's always a man in a suit when the dirt starts to show. He walked towards me with that gait of people who are used to bossing others around, as if his presence was enough to command respect, as if I were just another dumb farmer who couldn't read a contract and was now about to be explained how things work. I'd seen this kind of guy before, in the army, in meetings with superiors who wanted to push orders through without explanation, in the real estate market, when they tried to buy this land from me years ago, in the government, when they think they can dictate what you can and can't do with what's yours. He stopped a few paces away from me, straightened his tie, as if that would change anything, and gave me a smile that smelled false from afar. "Can we talk?" I laughed. Not because I thought it was funny, but because this guy's audacity amused me. Did he really think he could convince me with a smile and a few well-rehearsed words? "It depends," I replied. "Are you responsible for setting fire to my farm?" His smile faltered for a second. "Of course not, but I represent the interests of the HOA, and we're willing to offer reasonable compensation to bring this matter to an amicable close." I looked at the wreckage of my barn, at the twisted fence, at the fire-scarred earth. Then I looked at him again. "Let me get this straight. You want to pay me to pretend that none of this happened?" He sighed, as if he were dealing with a stubborn child. "I want to offer you an advantageous solution. Lawsuits are expensive, time-consuming, and stressful. We can avoid all that." So that was it. They were scared. The HOA knew it had fucked up and wanted to sort it out before it blew up, before the press arrived, before the community started questioning their power. I thought for a moment. I looked at him, then at the car, an expensive sedan with shiny wheels and a quiet engine. This guy had never picked up a hoe, never got his hands dirty, never built anything with his own effort. And now here he was, trying to negotiate the value of my dignity. I crossed my arms. "And how much do you think my farm is worth?" He smiled again, as if he was finally getting where he wanted to go. "We're prepared to offer you a price that covers your losses and compensates you for the inconvenience." I raised an eyebrow. "How much?" He paused, assessing the situation, and then said a number. That was the most insulting thing I've ever heard in my life. I blinked, trying to understand if he really believed that was fair. The amount he offered wouldn't even pay for the damage to the tools burnt in the fire, let alone the rest of the farm. So I laughed again, this time out loud. He frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "Something funny?" "You," I replied, thinking I'm stupid enough to accept it. His smile disappeared completely. "That's a generous deal. You should consider it." I took a step forward, reducing the space between us. He was taller, but height means nothing when you're already dead inside. And me? I was ready. "You burned my farm. You and your HOA stole what was mine. You think you can buy me off like I'm one of your office workers? I'm not that kind of man. I built this place with my hands. Do you think a piece of paper with a ridiculous number on it is going to make me forget everything you've done?" He opened his mouth to say something, but I kept going. "You want to avoid a lawsuit? Fine, but I'm not interested in your money. I'm interested in putting an end to all this shit." The guy took a deep breath, trying to keep his posture. "If that's how you want to play it, I hope you have good lawyers." "I have something better," I replied. The truth. His expression hardened. He already knew he'd lost this negotiation. Then, without saying another word, he turned his back, got into his car, and drove away. I stood there, watching him disappear down the road. And then, the TV station's truck came around the bend. Perfect. 10 minutes later, I was in front of a camera, telling exactly what happened. How the HOA burned my farm. How they falsified documents to take possession of the land. How they destroyed years of work and history because of arbitrary rules invented to maintain control over the community. I told them everything. And do you know what happened? The phone at the town hall exploded with calls. Neighbors started showing up, wanting to talk about their own problems with the HOA. One said he'd been fined because he'd painted his garage door the wrong color. Another said he had to pay a fortune to redo his garden, because the HOA thought it wasn't harmonious enough. And the best part? The police finally started moving. Because when you set fire to private property, when you falsify documents, and when you try to buy someone's silence with a cheap bribe, that's not just arrogance. It's a crime. And I was ready to watch each and every one of them fall. The day after the report, the HOA was already sinking in its own garbage. The City Hall phone rang non-stop. The TV replayed the story every hour. And the neighbors who had previously kept quiet were now spitting out stories about years of abuse, absurd fees, and regulations invented to suck every penny out of those who lived in the area. The woman? Gone. The same one who thought she owned the world, who got out of her truck and treated me like I was a wild animal in her backyard? Now she was locked inside her house, ignoring journalists, neighbors, and even the other HOA members who were beginning to realize that she was a leaky boat and no one wanted to sink with her. But I wasn't finished yet, because exposing these people on TV was just the beginning. They had to pay, literally. I took every piece of documentation I could find about the HOA's fraud, about the way they stole my farm, about the illegal fees they were charging the residents, and handed it all over to my lawyer. And not just any lawyer. This was one of those real sharks, a guy who didn't see lawsuits as a way to solve problems, but as a weapon to destroy enemies. By mid-afternoon, he had filed 3 different lawsuits against the HOA: trespassing, criminal destruction, and document fraud. And the best part? He wasn't alone. Other neighbors, motivated by the chaos I had started, began filing lawsuits of their own, one for abusive charges, another for unlawful restraint, and a few more because, apparently, this HOA was accumulating money from the neighborhood without being accountable to anyone. Which brings me to the most beautiful part of the story, the audit. The police showed up with a warrant to investigate the HOA's finances. And that's when it got really fun. They discovered that the woman and some other board members had been embezzling thousands of dollars from the association, pocketing ridiculous fees that they charged residents. Common area maintenance? Never done. Security fees? The money went straight into their pockets. And with that came the collapse. The first to leave was the man in the suit, the one who tried to buy me off with reasonable compensation. The next day, he publicly resigned, saying that he had no idea what was going on behind the scenes at the HOA. A lie, of course, but nobody wanted to hear any excuses. The second was another board member who tried to sneak out when he saw that the police were starting to connect the dots. But the woman? She held firm until the last minute. She locked the doors, pretended nothing was happening, ignored the journalists who had camped out in front of her house. But then came the bombshell. Investigators found a secret bank account in her name, with money that had no explanation of where it came from. And it was at that very moment that everything fell apart. The TV cameras were there when the police knocked on the door of her house. Everyone in the neighborhood was watching as she came out in handcuffs with an expression of pure humiliation. What was left of the HOA collapsed. The association was officially dissolved after financial irregularities were confirmed. No leadership, no money, no power. And me? I went back to my farm, or what was left of it. Because yes, I won every penny of compensation, both from the HOA and from the woman and the others involved. The judge had no mercy and ordered them to pay every dollar of the damage they had caused. I used the money to rebuild everything, better, bigger, stronger. Every piece of the fence was reinforced. Every structure was rebuilt with materials that wouldn't collapse so easily. The barn went up again, but this time I installed security cameras, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that people like this always come back to try and screw you over again. Only this time, I'd be ready. What's left of the HOA? Nothing but a warning to anyone who might try something similar in the future. And every time I sit on the porch, sipping my coffee and looking at my restored land, I remember one thing. If they had simply left me alone, They would be living their lives normally to this day, but they chose to start a war, and I finished it. If you liked this true story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel.